and welcome to Bad Book Club, where I, Jade, a silly goose with an English degree, read classic and popular literature so you don't have to. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Bad Book Club. Today we're talking about Secret Garden, which I've actually never read before, surprise, surprise. But I've heard of it just my whole life in terms of movies and shows and plays, and I just have never gotten around to reading it. And I thought it would just be a fun way to wrap up September because it's technically children's literature. It was written in like 1900s, so it's not like a children's book per se. It's readable for an adult like me, but it is cute and sweet, and in general just says a really nice message. And I thought it would be fun to wrap up September with this because it's actually my birthday on October 1st, so I wanted to read something fun and lighthearted. So that's what I did. And so now we can talk about Secret Garden, and I'm really excited to talk about it. And I'm going to try and keep this episode similar to Secret Garden in the fact that it's short and sweet. So it's not actually too short, but it's a really easy read. I read it literally in one day. If you have like 4 hours, you can read this book. So in any case, short and sweet is the name of the game, and I'm just going to get started. It was written by Frances Burnett. It was published in 1911, and actually it was published in a really interesting way. It was published serialized in like a magazine. So what that means is like every week she would release like 3 chapters in the magazine or the newspaper or whatever, and people would read it at home. So it was in little sections, and that actually makes a lot of sense to me because this book seems to move really quickly, especially at the beginning, and each chapter kind of has its own moment of something interesting, and that's because you have to keep it interesting for a reader to keep reading it because they have to wait like week to week to read it. So it's really interesting. And I did not know that Frances Burnett was the same woman who wrote A Little Princess, which is also a movie and a book that I've heard of like my whole life. And it's really, that one's really sad, I feel. Like this book's also a teeny bit sad, but I feel like that one's even sadder. But they both end in a cute way, not to give away the ending for you. But anyway, and The Secret Garden didn't actually get really big until after her death. Like, it wasn't really a huge thing until later on in, like, the world. I think she passed away in 1924, and it wasn't a big deal before then. And in her, like, obituary and stuff, it mentioned all her other works, and it didn't even talk about Secret Garden because it wasn't that big of a deal until, like, the 50s, and even the early 2000s, it had, like, a big rise for some reason, and it was called, like, one of the greatest books in America or something interesting, which is very cool. It's written in third person, and it's very interesting because she pops into the heads of everyone, including like animals. It's very adorable. And yeah, so we can just get started on the story if you would like. Mary Lennox is a spoiled, tyrannical little girl who lives with her uncaring parents in India and only cares for somewhat her nurse Aya. She is just apparently this yellow, tiny, sallow-faced girl who's just selfish and awful. And her parents just could not care less about her, which is also awful. And they have like a house full of servants and all this stuff. And one day, there's a cholera outbreak amongst their staff. And she goes to bed and she wakes up. And in the night, her parents have died. Her nurse, Aya, had died, and all the staff abandoned her, so she was just found alone in their house because no one had thought to grab her, and a British officer found her, and he was like, "Oh gosh, what are you doing here?" and realized that everyone had forgotten about her because she was just awful and small. And even her thoughts are like she doesn't care really that her parents are dead because she didn't know them that much, and she doesn't really like people. And Aya, her nurse, is dead, but she doesn't super really care and all that. It's kind of a bummer. And I'm not used to reading characters that are not likable, but it's so weird that I had to keep reading. She is taken in by an English clergyman and his poor family, and she stays with them for a while while they try to figure out what to do with her. They talk about how she's disdainful and just in general just not good with other kids or people, and their small children make fun of her and sing this song, which I have heard of and had no idea it was from this book, called Mistress Mary Quite Contrary, How Does Your Garden Grow? With silver bells and cockle shells and marigolds all in a row. I didn't know that was the full thing. I just knew Mistress Mary Quite Contrary. I've heard that said before, like maybe that's like a little jump rope thing that little kids listen to. I don't know. But anyway, she stays with them for a while, and all the kids make fun of her like that. And eventually we're told that she is going to be living with her uncle, Mr. Craven, in England. She has never heard of him before, never knew she had an uncle, and he's also described as a hunchback. So she's a little nervous about this because she does not know who this man is, and he sounds a little spooky. But all the same, they put her on a train with an officer's wife to meet Mrs. Medlock, who is supposed to take her to Misselthwaite Manor. What an interesting name, Misselthwaite. I was trying to understand if that might be just like a pun of some kind, like Mrs. Will Wait. I don't know, but it's called Misselthwaite, and I just feel like that's such an interesting name, but whatever. Anyway, Mary meets Mrs. Medlock, and neither of them like each other. They both seem to the other very severe and like not a fun character. And Mary usually doesn't like people anyway. And she says this. She's like, I don't like people anyway. So it doesn't surprise her. She doesn't like Mrs. Medlock. She didn't even really like her parents. Mr. Craven had asked Mrs. Medlock to pick up this little girl, and Mrs. Medlock is obviously kind of like, fine about it. And she does what she's asked, but she's grumpy. And they ride the next train together to get to Misselthwaite Manor. And on the way, probably from boredom, Mrs. Medlock tells Mary about the gloomy moor and manor that she is headed to. She says that Mr. Craven is kind of crooked and sour, and that his wife was very sweet, and they loved each other a lot until she died, and since then he's been kind of sad. And Mary's kind of weirdly interested in the story. She usually like purposefully is not interested and kind of like pouts all the time, but she finds herself really kind of pitying Mr. Craven and like really interested in what's going on. And I wrote in the margins here, it says, moments of sadness and understanding make us pity her, because while she's this awful little girl, she has these moments of feeling bad for Mr. Craven, or in general feeling sad because like people forgot her in their house all alone. And those moments really make us pity her and feel interested in the story of this girl who's just awful. It's really interesting because I was trying to decide why I was interested, because I usually am motivated by characters that I enjoy in books, and it's interesting to have a character that you don't enjoy and still feel like you're invested in their story. It's really similar, I think, to like Breaking Bad, where I really hated Walter White, but I wanted to know the plot. That's kind of how I felt here, but I like Mary more than I like Walter White. Sorry, everyone. Anyway, once they arrive, they both take a carriage to the manor and cross the moor. It's really dark, so Mary can't quite see what it looks like. For those of you who don't know what a moor is, neither does Mary, because she grew up in India, and they don't have moors there. I've seen one or two because for a while I studied abroad in Ireland and I visited Scotland, and they have the Highlands and things there, and I'm assuming it's pretty similar. It's like very flat, and there's lots of bushes and heather, and it's very like, I don't know, you could imagine like goats, I guess. I don't know how to describe it other than that, like, consider Scotland or Ireland, and that's probably the vibe that she's going for. And she says that it actually sounds like the sea because it's the wind rustling through all the bushes on the moor sounds like the sea, and she does not like it. Mary is like, ugh, I hate that. And they, in general, sit together and don't like each other, and both of them don't like the moor, and they arrive at the manor. Now, it might feel like I'm telling you all this very quickly, but I hope you know that we're only on page 12. So the book moves very quickly itself. I was telling you before that this was a serial story, so it was given out in pieces. And I think the beginning has to be quick because no one wants to read this part of the story for that long, especially if you're just reading it in a magazine or a newspaper. So this really clips along quickly. So it feels like I'm really blowing through it, I bet, but I'm on page 12. So don't worry, we're going to get there. They arrive at the manor, and this man named Mr. Pitcher says that Mr. Craven does not want to see her and just to take her to her rooms. So Miss Medlock does take her to her rooms in this like really big house through like tons of corridors and says, these are your 2 rooms. Do not leave. Do not poke around. Like, stop. And so Mary goes to bed and wakes up the next morning, and Martha, the maid, is building a fire. And Frances Burnett has written Martha and people some people in this story with accents. Nowadays, the process of writing someone with an accent isn't really a thing anymore. I think it's supposed to it sometimes comes across as a little offensive, I think. But this is broad Yorkshire, and it was a little confusing for me to read at first, only because they say thy, but they don't say thy because there's a comma, so she says the. And for a while, I was like, why is she saying the like that? And I was like, oh, it's because she's saying thy, and then it made sense to me. So it's a little confusing to read at first, but I think it works for this book because it's supposed to be like kind of fun and cute, but accents just in general, just so you know, aren't super a thing in literature anymore. I don't read books that often where the dialogue is written with an accent. Sometimes they'll say that a person has an accent, but they won't write it like that. I think because it's in general just hard to read. Like it was a little hard to read, but you get used to it, so it's fine. But anyway, Martha is there building a fire, and Mary is like, are you going to dress me now? You're such a strange servant, because Martha's kind of like chattering away. And Martha's like, you can't dress yourself. And Mary's like, that's not the custom. And she's in general like not being very nice. And Martha's like, look, there's a part here that did not age well, where Martha talks about how she came in because she thought that Mary might have been, quote unquote, black from India, and that she was really curious and wanted to see her. And then Mary gets really offended because Martha thought she was, quote unquote, a native. I think it's the part of the book that really, really did not age well. I don't think there's anything else in the book that's very questionable like this, but this was like a little shocking to read. I was like, oh gosh, we're literally on page like 15. This is a lot. But basically, Martha is confused because she doesn't understand why Mary can't dress herself. And Mary literally has no idea how to dress herself because she's spoiled and rotten. And after she is offended because Martha calls her a native, Mary breaks into tears, I guess because of just the changes overall in her life and like the way things have gone. And Martha helps her get dressed a little bit. While she's dressing her, Martha tells her about her brother Dickon and his love for animals. Martha has 12 brothers and sisters, and one of them is Dickon, who loves animals so much, and I think in a way they're similar ages, so she's kind of comparing Dickon and Mary. She's like, look, you should get over this. Like Dickon, our boy Dickon is totally fine and dresses himself and wanders the moor with his animals, and Mary's kind of intrigued by this boy named Dickon. And she goes to eat breakfast, but she isn't hungry. And again, Martha's like, our Dickon would love that, but go play outside like Dickon would. And Mary's like, ugh, why would I play outside? But okay. And she goes out and looks around. Now, before she goes out and looks around, Martha does mention a locked garden that Mr. Craven had locked up after his wife died. His wife died and he buried the key, and no one has been in that garden for 10 years. So while Mary is walking around, she is really intrigued by this idea of the garden. I get the implication that Mary hasn't had a lot of curiosity or thoughts in general in her life, and today she's had two. She's wondered and been intrigued by Dickon and this garden. You may have noticed already that Martha is the maid and Mary is the main character, and I've already tripped up over those names a couple times, so if I say one and mean the other, I'm really sorry. I might not catch it if I'm editing, because I barely caught it while I was writing and reading about this. So anyway, let's keep going. Outside, there are actually a lot more than just one garden. She sees gardens all over. In fact, in one garden, she sees an old man, tilling the ground. I don't garden. I don't know what he's doing. He has materials and tools, and he's gardening. And she comes across him, and he's fairly gruff and grumpy, but she also sees a singing robin that's like red, like a bird, in a tree over one of the walls. And she enjoys it and thinks of the mystery of where he's from, because he's standing at this tree behind this wall, and she can't seem to figure out how to get in there. And anyway, she comes across him, and she says, do you know that there's a robin? He says, yeah, and he whistles, and the robin comes to him, and he tells her that he is a robin redbreast, and his name is Ben Weatherstaff, and he's very, like gruff and old manish, and he mentions that the robin is his only friend, and she tells him that she has no friends, and she admits that she's kind of lonely. And Ben says that they're actually very similar because they probably have nasty tempers. And this shocks her because she's like, oh, I have never heard anyone tell me the truth about myself before. I didn't realize that I was nasty. And the robin comes over to her and he kind of chirps, and Mary asks the robin if he wants to be her friend, and he kind of chirps back and flies over the wall, and she asks Ben, what is over there? And Ben says that's his home, and it has no door, and no one's been in there for 10 years, and then he leaves. And this is a big turning point, I think, in the book, because we've gone from Mary being just awful to Mary being someone who actively feels lonely and thinks that she has no friends, and we pity her a bit more. And we also see that she's already starting to change, because up until this moment, she literally did not think of anything similar to this and had no thoughts on herself or what type of person she is or how many friends she has. She didn't think of it. And she's realizing that she's somewhat nasty of a person. And she's also very curious about several things now: the garden, the bird, Dickon, and this man named Ben. She's talked to and been intrigued by more things than she has in her entire life. And after this is when we begin to see real change in Mary. It mentions that daily she would wake up and run to the window and look at the moor for a while and decide she would go out and walk around the moor. And she hated the wind and she hates running against it, and she's not that big a fan of the moor, but color is starting to come to her cheeks. And one day she's hungry for breakfast because she's been running around and she's starting to gain weight. And then another day she sees the robin again on the garden wall. And she speaks to him, and he seems to say to her in her brain, like, isn't it a nice day today? How wonderful is it? And she laughs and she's like, I like you. And she just likes the robin. She's having a good time laughing on the moor. And he flies back to the garden, and she begins to like the moor, and just every day more and more. She's just beginning to enjoy herself. She's starting to act like a kid, because up until this point, she's been like weirdly not a kid. And on a random rainy day, I think it's the first rainy day she experiences, Martha tells her about the wuthering around the moor, the manor of the wind. Apparently this is the sound that the wind makes as it kind of hits the manor, and Mary actually says she likes it. And she asks about the garden some more. She's like, why did he hate the garden? And Martha tells her that Mrs. Craven loved it, and they both tended to their roses together. And one day she had this branch that she liked to sit on, but the branch fell, and the next day she died. And at this point, Frances Burnett tells us that there were 4 things that were happening that is good to Mary. So let me pull that up. She had felt as if she understood a robin and that he had understood her. She had run in the wind until her blood had grown warm. She had been healthily hungry for the first time in her life, and she had found out what it was to be sorry for someone. So those are the 4 good things that have happened to Mary since she's been living in the manor, which is very cool because apparently she just hadn't experienced that ever before. On this same day, she's sitting with Martha and mentions that she thinks she hears crying. And Martha says, no, it's just the wind. And then the door bangs open and she can very clearly hear someone crying and sobbing. And Mary says, no, it's very clearly someone crying. And Martha says, no, it's just the wind, or it's the maid who has a toothache. And Mary doesn't quite believe her. So this book so far is giving me lots of romanticism vibes, and I've told you a little bit about literary movements over time, which is basically just that there are certain movements in terms of books where trends made the market a thing. So romanticism was this era from, I want to say 1800s, early 1800s to almost the entire century, like the 1890s, where it was in response to the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment came around and everything was really sciencey and factual. And I guess in their reading, people wanted the opposite of that. They wanted something more mysterious and suspenseful and in general more mystical and things like that. So romanticism is really heavy on family, and every time you're sad, it rains outside. And the Gothic was sort of a branch of romanticism, and that's what this book is kind of reminding me of at the moment, is Gothic literature. And that's stuff like Frankenstein, like monsters, or just in general, manors where there's mysterious crying and doors flying open and, rain on the moor and stuff like that, secret gardens that have been locked up. It's very Gothic. It's very supernatural and interesting, and it's really fun to read, especially on rainy days or in the fall. And I was a little surprised because this book was written in like the 1900s. So it's actually technically a little bit after the Romantic period, but it's close enough that it makes sense that she would write this, especially if it was for children. It gives me lots of Jane Eyre vibes because Jane Eyre is also romantic and also gothic because it is a romance story where it's very spooky also. So in any case, I just was thinking on that because I was like, this is fun to read. I didn't expect The Secret Garden to be gothic because in my head, if it's a children's book, it's not gothic. But it makes sense to me that that would be that way. And it's not scary gothic, it's just suspenseful. So yeah, that's the end of my literary movement rant. Let's keep going with the story. On a day with nothing to do, Mary decides to wander the old house and to see if there are really 100 rooms that have been locked up, which is something that Mrs. Medlock told her on the train. So this is another example of Mary feeling curiosity and intrigue and deciding to act on it, which is different for her. In her adventures, she finds a gallery, a room with pictures of this small, sort of stiff girl, and a room that has a cabinet full of elephants carved out of ivory, a room with a mouse in a sofa cushion. And after all of her exploring, she decides to walk back, and she actually gets a little lost, but she finds the right way, and she eventually hears the crying again right in the corridor, and she notices there's a tapestry that is covering a hallway, and that's where the crying is coming from. And Mrs. Medlock comes through this corridor, sees her, and scolds her and sends her back to her room, being like, you shouldn't be out, stop wandering, like, you stay here, and is, like, in general being really mean. And she didn't want her to hear the crying, quite obviously. And that's the end of the chapter, so it's very mysterious. And 2 days later, the moor is beautiful, and it's a really blue sky for the very first time since Mary's been there. Since so far, it's been kind of gloomy, lots of fog, that kind of thing. And Mary is super excited about it, more excited than we've seen her be this entire book. And we learn that the accent Martha speaks with is called Broad Yorkshire. And Mary tells Martha she wants to see Martha's cottage and her family and Dickon, her brother, and her mom, and eventually she's like, I like them all. And they come into this conversation of how Mary doesn't really like people or how people don't really like Mary. And Martha says, well, do you like yourself? And Mary says, I guess not really. I've never thought about it before. And it's kind of interesting. Martha's like, well, my mom once asked me that and it changed my life. So there you go. And she starts talking to Mary about spring, how spring is slow here, but if you wait for it, it'll be beautiful. And so Mary goes out and she sees Ben and the robin again, and the robin like hops around and seems to remember her, and she's really excited about that. And he's crouching near this little flower bed, and Mary realizes there's a hole in the ground in the flower bed he's perched next to, and she finds a key, and she realizes it must be the key to the secret garden. So, whoa. Martha gets back from the cottage. So that day, while Mary was walking around the moor, Martha had gone home to her family where the cottage was, and then the next day she comes back. So she had a little vacation, came back. And the next day, Martha gives Mary a present from her mom. Apparently a little traveler had driven by selling wares, and her mom, with what little they had, decided to buy a present for Mary, which is actually super cute because it sounds like they have trouble feeding each other, and yet she bought a jump rope for this girl she doesn't know. And she gives it to Mary, and Mary's really excited, and she's like, wow, I wonder if I can ever skip like you do, because Martha shows her how to use it. And she skips to Ben, who is surprised, because he's like, oh, you actually look like a child now. That's what a surprise. And Mary keeps jump roping, trying to get better at it, and she comes across the robin again. He's sitting on top of this wall to the garden, like standing there, and below him is this heavy, like, strands of ivy. And while she's staring at the robin, all of a sudden a breeze comes by and shifts the ivy and reveals a door. She quickly grabs onto the door, puts the key inside because she's carried the key in her pocket this whole time, and opens it, and then realizes that she is standing now in the garden. She tells us it's a place full of plants. Some look dead, but there are these pretty green shoots on the floor, pretty much like everywhere. She sees many of them, and she moves the plants around. Like, she realizes, oh, like, they're really crowded, so she kind of replants them in areas that are less busy, just because she thinks that it'll help them breathe, is what she says. And it's actually really cute. We get the point of view of the robin, who mentions he's happy to see someone in the garden taking care of it, especially this tiny human who seems really sweet. And that day when Mary comes back, she asks Martha if she could help her get like a spade so she can dig things and some seeds because she wants to try and grow this garden. She's not sure how much of the garden is dead, how much of it is alive, but she knows that there are green things growing. And she asks like, what are the white things that are under the ground? And they tell her those are bulbs and that kind of thing. And Martha mentions, well, if you want a spade, if you want to plant something just on the gardens, they don't realize she means the secret garden. She just asks, if I were to plant something at a garden no one cares about, like, how would I do that? And Martha says, well, why don't we write to Dickon, because you know how to print, and ask him to buy you a spade because you have enough money for it, and some seeds, and he'll bring it back for you because he knows all about this stuff. And Mary says, oh, perfect idea. And they write a letter to Dickon asking him to go to town, get her some gardening supplies and some seeds, and to bring it back. Mary says that she's starting to love to move and play more, and she's getting faster and stronger, and she's putting on weight, and she actually likes being outside now, and she likes the wind on the moor, and she has color in her cheeks, and she's so excited, and we're told by the narrator that while she is blooming like this, the bulbs that she has replanted also feel rejuvenated because she's replanted them. And she goes to Ben, and he and her talk more, and he notices that she's looking better and more child and healthier, and Ben teases the robin daily, and this is the first comment that we get about magic. She mentions that the robin landed on Ben's little like shovel, like there was magic in the handle of his shovel. It's said with a capital M, like she has heard of this before. Like somewhere in India, she mentions that she heard of magic in stories, and she thinks this is what it must be. That's what it is, magic, because the robin landed on the handle. Anyway, Ben and her talk about roses. She asks, how can you tell if roses are still alive? And neither of them realize that what they're talking about is the same place, because Ben says, well, roses are fickle, but you have to prune them, and usually you can tell by X, Y, and Z. And there used to be a rose garden I liked, and my friend used to really like roses, and she died a while back, and he's talking about the secret garden. And he mentions that he used to care for roses after she passed away, but now he can't because his bones are getting worse. And she doesn't realize he's talking about the garden. He doesn't realize she's asking about the secret garden because she wants to know if the roses are still alive there. But they're both talking about the same thing. And that afternoon, she goes to the secret garden, or she's on her way, and she sees a boy sitting outside, and around him there's 2 squirrels, 2 rabbits, a pheasant that he's petting, and this is obviously Dickon. He sees her, she sees him, and he slowly stands up, telling her not to scare the animals, and he gives her the supplies. He shows her this was the spade, and he tells her, oh, this is these plants, they're, I don't know all the names of the plants, but he just tells her these are the seeds that I got for you. They should be easy to plant. Where are you planning to plant them? And shyly, she's like, I don't really know anything about boys, but can you keep a secret? And he was like, well, yes, I can. And so she shows him the secret garden, and he shows her which roses are still alive and which are, kind of passed away, dead now. And then he shows her how to plant bulbs, and he praises her work with moving the bulbs to a new place. He's like, I thought you couldn't garden. She was like, well, it just looked like that's what should be done. He was like, oh, that's so good. And they spend the day planting seeds together in the garden. And he mentions that gardening is really good for you and that he's a very healthy boy. And this actually made me a little nervous when I first read it, because honestly, if you bring up a subject, it tells me that subject might come up later. So he brought up that he was healthy. And now I understand that he brought that up because it was supposed to imply that gardening and in general being one with nature and spending time outside is supposed to make you healthy. But it could also have gone a darker way where now that he's mentioned how healthy he is, one day he won't be. So I was a little nervous during this book that something bad would happen to Dickon just because he mentioned that. But because it's a children's book, nothing bad happens to Dickon. I'll just tell you right now. She agrees with this, claim that he's healthy because he stands outside and because he's a good boy and hangs out in nature and likes animals and whatever. And she mentions that she likes only 5 people and that he's one of them. And he says, oh, that's so few people. And she's like, well, not many people like me. And he says, well, who likes you? And she says, well, the robin likes me. And then she says, do you like me? And he says, yeah. And she says, well, that's 2 now, including you, which is really cute. And that day, she goes back to the manor for lunch, knowing that Dickon, I almost said Dwight for some reason, Dickon will keep her secret about the garden. She makes it back to the manor, expecting to have lunch, and instead she's told that Mr. Craven has returned. He's back and that he wants to see her. She is really frightened and doesn't want to go, but she goes. And she mentions that around adults, when she's nervous, she stops being this outgoing, sweet girl that she's become and kind of relapses back to like her stiffer manner. But he seems nice. He's kind of sitting in his chair and they bring her in and he asks her if she's well, if she's having a good time, if she needs any toys. And he seems to kind of pity her and feel a little sad. And she requests not to have a governess yet because he mentions, should I get one for you? And she says no, because she wants to keep running around. And he seems to mention Martha's mom, Mrs. I think her name is Sowerby, and says, yeah, she was right. She said I should let you kind of get stronger before I bring a governess into the equation. So you won't have one yet. And she goes, oh, thank goodness. And he says, is there anything else she wants to do? And she says, I wouldn't mind a bit of earth, which is a little bit of a funny phrase. And he says, what are you talking about? And she says, can I please have a garden? And he says, yeah, anywhere is fine. You can't do any harm, a little thing like you. So anywhere you want to garden is fine. And she's happy because she's like, yes, I have permission to garden. And she thinks he's really nice, but kind of sad. And she tells that to Martha. And Martha's like, yep. And she goes back to the secret garden after lunch, and Dickon has left, and she's actually a little sad. She's like, oh no, did I imagine him? But he left a note saying that he'll come back, and he drew a little bird on it. The next day is a rainy day. She can't really go outside, so she just hangs out, and that night she hears the crying again. And she decides, I have to go see what it is. So she walks out into the hallway, and then she finds the little, what's it called, tapestry, and she goes through the corridor, and she goes to a room and finds a boy laying on a bed, like crying. And he turns his face and she sees him, and he asks her if she's a ghost. And she says, no, are you a ghost? And both of them think the other person's a ghost. And so she goes closer, and he's like, wait, let me make sure you're not a ghost. And he touches her, and he's like, my name is Colin Craven. And he tells her that Mr. Craven is his father. She tells him Mr. Craven is her uncle, and they have never heard or seen each other, and neither of them knew the other one was there. He mentions that he doesn't like people to see him because he's ill very often, and his dad doesn't really like him or love him, and he hates fresh air, and he's kind of an invalid. And she tells him she's from India and what happened, and he tells her everyone thinks that he's going to die, which is kind of a bummer. I guess his whole life, the servants and the doctors have all been like, oh, he's probably going to die at some point. And he doesn't know anything about a garden. She kind of mentions it in passing, and he goes, what are you talking about? And she tells him, yeah, after your mom died, Mr. Craven locked up this garden, and I've been looking for it because it's a secret garden. And he's like, well, I must find it. I'm going to order my servants to find the key and we'll go see it. And she goes, no, please keep it a secret. Wouldn't it be better if it was secret and it was just ours and we could go and breathe the fresh air? And he's like, actually, that does sound nice. And she notices there's a curtain like kind of hanging above the fireplace. And she goes, what is that? And she pulls it apart, like, pulls the curtain aside, and she sees a portrait, and he tells her that it's of his mom and that he doesn't like it when she looks at him because he's always sick and sickly. And she sings him to sleep with a little song from India, and then she leaves. So we've finally figured out who the boy is. I'll tell you, I was reading this book and nothing I thought would happen kind of happened, I think, because I was expecting kind of like maybe a darker novel or maybe just something different. But I didn't know that there was going to be a boy, an invalid boy that she meets. I'm saying invalid because that's like what he says. And it's usually someone just who's kind of sickly and doesn't go outside and that kind of thing, especially used back in the day and oddly used a lot in like romantic literature. And anyway, I expected the story to go differently. I thought it would be how Mary kind of wins the heart of old Mr. Crotchety Craven Craven. I thought that was what the story was going to be. And instead we have Dickon and we have Mr. Colin Craven, the son, who's kind of, sickly. And Mr. Craven isn't there at all. He's on vacation for the summertime. So it was really interesting. It's not how I expected the story to go. And it's cool that we get to find out what the crying is so early. And it's not gothic or spooky. It's just a boy who's been crying. So anyway, I imagine Mary's also thankful that she found out what the noise was. And the next day is still a rainy day. And she decides that she'll tell Martha she met Colin. So she does. And Martha is absolutely shocked. She's like, oh my God. And she's like, did he like you? He hates people. And Mary is like, yeah, he liked me. We hung out and we talked and I sang him to sleep. And Martha's like, oh my God, I'm going to be fired because they're going to think I showed you him and he's going to get me fired. And, She gives Mary more information about Colin. This is what she says. First, Martha starts this conversation by saying, the world's coming to an end. And it's really funny. But Mary says, what's the matter with him? And Martha says, nobody knows for sure and certain. Mr. Craven went off his head like when he was born. The doctors thought he'd have to be put in asylum. It was because Mrs. Craven died, like I told you. He wouldn't set eyes on the baby. He just raved and said it'd be another hunchback like him and it'd better die. Is Colin a hunchback? Mary said. He didn't look like one. He isn't yet, said Martha, but he began all wrong. Mother said there was enough trouble and raging in the house to set any child wrong. They was afraid his back was weak, and they've always been taking care of it, keeping him lying down and not letting him walk. Once they made him wear a brace, but he fretted so he was downright ill. Then a big doctor came to see him and made them take it right off. He talked to the other doctor in quite a polite way. He said there'd been too much medicine and too much letting him have his own way. I think he's a very spoiled boy, says Mary. And Martha basically says, yeah, he's the worst. He's very spoiled. None of us can talk to him because he'll fire us. He gets his way no matter what the way is. And that's why Martha's so scared she's going to be fired. But Mary says that she talked to Colin and they've agreed that, it's fine that she comes to see him and he likes her. So it'll all be fine, Martha. Poor Martha. And later that afternoon, it's proved because Colin sends away his nurse and calls for Martha and tells her that while the nurse is gone, he wants Mary to visit him. And Martha's dumbfounded and tells Mary, go talk to him. And she's worried. And Colin talks to her and says, well, what are you worried about? And she's like, I'm worried Mrs. Medlock will fire me. And he says, well, if she does that, I'll fire her. So you're fine and safe and you're dismissed. And she's like, okay, and she leaves. And he and Mary are having such a good time laughing and, talking loudly that Mrs. Medlock comes in with his doctor, Dr. Craven, and they're both shocked to find them there. And they're both really worried. They're like, oh no, he shouldn't be overexcited. But they realize he's looking better today. And he says, look, I will do what I want. And I want Mary here. So get out and bring me some tea. So they bring him some tea. And she is all stiff again when they come in, so they can't really tell why they're having such a good time together. But he actually eats for once with Mary. And during that week, it's completely rainy, and they continue to talk to each other. And she tells Colin all about a garden, and she doesn't tell him she's discovered it. She just says, there could be a garden, and I bet it would look like this. And she mentions that she's looking better, and probably it would be good for Colin, too, to be out in the fresh air and to see the garden. And she tells him all about Dickon, and he says he wants to meet him. And on a sunny day, she runs to the garden. Dickon is there, and the flowers have bloomed in all the rain, and the robin is beginning to build a nest, and they watch the robin. And she tells Dickon about Colin, and Dickon agrees that Colin should see the garden because it might help him. After their conversation, Mary runs for food at the manor and leaves Dickon in the garden. And Martha is worried that Colin will be upset. So, she goes for food, and she's like, oh, I gotta go now, bye. And Martha's like, wait, you're not gonna talk to Colin? And Mary's like, no, I have to go hang out in the garden with Dickon. And she's like, I really wish you would talk to Colin. And Mary's like, oh, it'll be fine. And she runs back to the garden and sees Dickon, and he comments that Mary looks better. And she says, yes, I'm getting fatter and fatter every day. And she's really happy about it. And they run around and they have the best time, and they look after their flowers and look at the robin. And she gets back to the manor really excited to tell Colin about her day and about the garden. And Martha says that he's having a big tantrum. So Mary goes to see him, and he's really mad and says that I won't let you see Dickon anymore if you're not going to come talk to me. And she's like, what? She's like, you're selfish. Like, I won't talk to you if you send Dickon away. And he's like, well, I'll force you to talk to me. And she's like, no, I'll sit here and pout and not talk to you. You're selfish. Dickon is better than you. And he says, well, I think there's a lump on my back and I'm going to die. And she says, you won't die. You're just being selfish and mean. And she runs out. And she realizes on her way back that he might just be in hysterics because when he's like upset, he thinks that something might be wrong with him. So she realizes, in her room, she might have been a little hard on him and decides to go see him tomorrow morning. However, in the middle of the night, she wakes up because he's having an even bigger tantrum and he's like screeching and screaming. And the nurse comes to her room and says, please, can you help? Like he's really upset. And she goes, okay. And she runs to his room getting more upset as she goes. And she arrives and she yells at him. And it's actually a really funny scene that I'll read to you. You stop, she almost shouted. You stop. I hate you. Everybody hates you. I wish everyone would run out of the house and let you scream yourself to death. You will scream yourself to death in a minute, and I wish you would. And he kind of stops because, this is me talking now, he stops because he's very shocked. And he's like, I can't stop. I'm upset. And she says, if you scream another scream, I'll scream too, and I can scream louder than you can, and I'll frighten you. I'll frighten you. And he was like, but something's wrong with me. And she's like, nuh-uh, half that ails you is hysterics and temper. Just hysterics, hysterics, hysterics. And stamps her foot each time. And he says that he felt a lump on his back. And she says, you didn't. It was a hysterical lump. There's nothing wrong with you. Turn over and let me see. And so he does. And she says, there's not a single lump there. There's not a lump as big as a pin except backbone lumps. And that's only because you're so thin. And she said, if you ever say there's a lump there again, I will laugh. And this has like the biggest effect on Colin because no one has ever spoken to him this way before. And it's almost like it breaks him out of this reverie because she's being so ridiculous and screaming in his face that he seems almost hopeful for the first time that he might not die sometime soon and that he might live and that there might be nothing wrong with him, at least that night. He tells her that he's sorry for what he said before and that he really hopes that he might see the garden and that might help. And she tells him about the garden that day, not visiting the garden, but what it could look like and about how she met Dickon. And she talks to him slowly as he falls asleep. The next morning, Mary briefly sees Colin to tell him she's going to do something with the garden and that, she'll come back in a minute to tell him about it. And he's very excited. So she goes to see Dickon and they talk about how they have to get Colin into the garden to see it because they both think it will help him a lot. And there's this really cute moment where she tries to talk in the Yorkshire accent and she goes to see Colin that afternoon and she tries again and they're both laughing really hard. And she finally tells him about the garden, that she has found it and that Dickon will come to visit tomorrow with all his creatures and that they are going to somehow get him there to see it. And Colin is just ecstatic. It's at this moment that Dr. Craven comes in and sees them laughing and hanging out, and he's just shocked. And Colin says that they're going to go out, and he's going to go out with Mary and see the garden. And Doctor's like, oh, I don't know about that. Like, who is the nurse going with you? And Colin's like, no, but Dickon, a boy I know, is going to push me. And Dr. Craven knows Dickon and is like, oh, okay, well, I trust him, so sure. And he leaves kind of dumbfounded, but he's like, all right. And that afternoon, Colin tells them that no one should disturb them on their walk, that he doesn't want to be seen, quote unquote. So make sure the garden is just not, there and no one is going to bother them and all that jazz. And they keep talking and Mary's calm with the doctor now. She's not all stiff. So they're both experiencing a lot of growth. And that night, Colin sleeps really well. And Mary comes in the next morning ecstatic because she says it's spring. And she opens the window and he breathes in the fresh air and they order breakfast and they eat. And Dickon comes in and he has a crow named Soot on his shoulder and a red fox is walking next to him. And the two squirrels, Nut and Shell, are in his pocket. And he's holding a baby lamb. And he puts the baby lamb on Colin's lap and Colin feeds him and they talk to him about the garden and how he's going to see it. And there's this whole little mini story about how Dickon found the lamb and its mother had, died and how he took care of it, which is really cute. And 1 week later, they finally go to see the garden. On the week, it was all windy, so they couldn't go because of Colin's, weak life, I guess. And they plan their excursion. So Colin, like I said, made sure the gardener would not have anyone out on the sidewalks or in the gardens to see them walking. And the nurse comes in to get Colin ready, and he helps dress himself, just like Mary learned how to. I guess he didn't before either. And then they have a really strong footman carry Colin down in his chair, and Dickon pushes them to the empty gardens. And Colin loves the fresh air, and he's having such a nice time. And Mary walks them towards the garden, pointing out all of their moments. So she's like, oh, that's where I met the robin. That's where Ben Weatherstaff works. And Colin gets excited, and they finally make it inside the garden. He says it's beautiful. There's so much greenery. There's flowers growing everywhere, trees growing tall, and there's color in his face. And at this moment, he says, I shall get well and live forever. And he's really excited, and it's very cute. And that day, they talk about how perfect it is and how surprising it is that it's a beautiful, perfect day. And they talk and they watch the robin. And this is when talk of magic starts to come in. So this is a really big deal in the last part of the book here, is this concept of magic, which is some sort of spirit or strength or goodness. It might be God, it might be all these other things, but they call it magic. And Colin seems to think there's magic in Dickon's mom because she understands children. Dickon has magic because he understands animals, and that there's magic in the garden that will help him feel better. And that day they have servants bring them lunch and they're eating it. And it's during this that they're all hanging out that Ben Weatherstaff sees them because he's standing on a ladder and watching them over the wall. And he just yells at Mary. He's like, I didn't like you in the first place. What are you doing in there? And then Ben sees Colin. He's absolutely shocked that he's not a cripple. He's like, oh, you don't have wacky legs and a bad back? And Colin says, no, I'm normal. And he stands up, and Colin tells Ben to come in, and he's very adorable. He's like, oh, yes, sir. And he comes in, and Colin tells him that there's magic everywhere and that he is standing. And Ben says that he's cared for the garden for a long time by climbing over the ladder, but that's why he can't do it anymore because the ladder's really hard for a guy who's old like him. And they walk him around and they plant a rose bush together. And Colin's just ecstatic because he's standing and digging like a normal boy. And he walks to a nearby tree, and he stands for the sunset. And back in the manor, he goes in a chair. Colin is kind of rude to the doctor, and Mary points it out because he's like, look, I'm not talking to you anymore. And Mary's like, that was kind of rude. And Colin's like, oh, interesting. I didn't realize. And Colin again talks about how he's certain that there is a certain magic in the garden. And for months we go by, the garden blooms and it's beautiful. And Colin says he's going to be a scientist that studies magic. And his first experiment will be that they'll chant that magic is inside them all together every day, and that will make him well because of magic. It's a very childish notion. It's the first one that we've really come across because I think in the book, strangely, Mary doesn't really start off as a kid, and neither does Colin. So they're getting more kiddish in the fact that they believe very strongly in magic, and it's very cute. And it mentions basically they believe in themselves. It's like a visualization things, but Ben's there too, and they all chant about magic being inside them all and Colin being strong. And Ben watches as Colin walks around the garden every day, and they decide that they're going to keep it a secret that Colin is getting better so that he can surprise his father when he returns from his travels. How has y'all's week been? Has it been good? I've had a really good week. I love fall, and it's finally come to Texas, and I'm so happy about it because it's been really hot here for so long, and I'm so happy it's not just boiling outside. I'm sure we'll still have some hot days, but I'm just happy that we're starting to get a breeze even. I'm really excited about that. And it's my birthday week, as I mentioned before, so I'm really excited about that because I am 23 this year. I know, right? I'm old. And yeah, it's just been a nice week. And this was a good book, I think, for this week. I promise I'll get back to the story at some point, but I thought I would make conversation. I haven't focused on you enough in this conversation. It's just been so one-sided, and I didn't want it to feel like that, so I thought I would tell you more about my personal life. But I'm really glad I did the secret garden this week because it was really sweet and short and like a cute little story for me to talk about. And it's all about spring and rejuvenation and just feeling better and all those things. So it was really nice and comforting and a cute read. So I had a good time. Anyway, let's get back to the story, which is what you're here for this week. Anyway, Dickon tells his mom about the garden. I'm sorry, I have this written down and my handwriting is just illegible. But Colin and Mary, he tells his mom that Colin and Mary are pretending to still be like anxious and sick at the manor because they don't want anyone to write his father about how well he's getting because he wants it to be a surprise. So they are kind of pretending to be sick and pretending to yell at servants and laughing, trying not to break out into laughter. And Dickon's mom likes that they're enjoying themselves and laughing and having a good time. And Dickon mentions that they're having trouble hiding the fact that they're always hungry because they're eating all the food, which is really good, but they're having trouble because they're trying to pretend to be sick, but they're eating all the food. And Mrs. Sowerby says that she'll help and send food to the garden to help with their show so that no one knows what's going on. And Colin tries to convince the doctor that he's eating and it's just something bad. He's like, maybe I'm overeating. You don't know. And during this time tells the doctor that he forbids anyone to contact his father because he doesn't want to worry his father, quote unquote. And it's just because he wants to surprise him. And Colin, thinks that Dickon's mom has magic with children and they talk about it and he still walks around the garden every day. And Dickon tells us about how he met this man in town who was really muscly and he asked the man how he got so muscly and the man showed him his exercises and they start doing them together, which is very cute. And since they start eating less because Mrs. Sowerby is sending them food each day, the staff gets really confused because they look great but they're not eating and so they're very concerned. And then we jump into this cute little chapter from the robin's point of view. The robin mentions that he and his mate are very concerned for their eggs in their nest because at first they have this weird boy who's here that he trusts Dickon and he likes the little girl, but this new boy is odd and they have to help him around and his mate's very concerned, but after a while, they realize it's like the boy is learning to fly and they really like the boy and they watch him every day. And it's a very cute little moment from the robin's point of view. And then we jump to a rainy day. On rainy days, apparently, up until now, they've just been really sad because they can't go to the garden. But Mary has this idea that she and Colin should just walk through the manor, through the rooms, like she did that one time. And they go to the gallery and he runs around and he realizes that he likes his house and he's never seen it before, which is really weird. And they make it back to his rooms, and Mary realizes that he's pulled back the curtain from his mom's portrait. And he tells her, yeah, he did it because one day he woke up at night and it was like magic filled the room and he just opened the curtain and she was smiling at him and it made him happy to see it now instead of sad. And we learn that Colin is still just really happy about the magic and ecstatic about his change. And one day they're in the garden and he's digging and he just stands up and says, you know what? I'm well now. I'm a normal boy. I'm digging right now. We should, celebrate. And they sing a hymn and it's like another type of magic and Ben's Weatherstaff cries and it's really cute. And at this moment, Dickon's mom comes in to the garden for the first time and we meet her for the first time and she hugs Colin tight and calls him dear lad and it's really sweet. And she tells Mary that she looks exactly like her beautiful mother, which Mary is really flattered by because she's like, I was always told that I look awful. And she says that magic has many names. It can be the big good thing in the world or just the joy maker or God, and that she's happy, they're happy. It's just a very sweet chapter where everyone is having a good time, hugging each other, talking about how good they are at everything, and about the magic that's infused in life and in the garden, which is very adorable. The next chapter jumps into kind of like the narrator discussing with the reader how negative thoughts can take over and we won't realize it. So it mentions, at the beginning, Mary didn't know that when she thought only about bummer things and sad things that she was, not a good child. And Colin didn't know that if he worried and fretted over his health all the time, that he would in fact be sick. And it says, this cute little poem, where you tend a rose, a thistle cannot grow. So it basically says that if you invest in good thoughts, that you can rejuvenate yourself and others. And it switches to the story of a man who wandered in beautiful places and was miserable. And we obviously know that this is Mr. Craven. So he's been gone all summer, traveling, wandering, feeling just miserable about his life, his wife being gone, his son, until one day in a valley he lays down and stares at these forget-me-nots that are blue and beautiful. And he just wonders at their beauty and stillness. And that one nice thought kind of takes over his brain. And over the next couple of days, he starts thinking more nice thoughts. And on the same day, he dreams of his wife in the garden talking to him about how she's in the garden and that he should come home. And he wakes up feeling kind of confused. And when he wakes up, he has a letter from Susan Sowerby, which says that she thinks, if she can be so bold, that he should come home because she thinks there's something interesting for him there, especially with his son. And at first he's really worried. And he's like, oh no, has he gotten worse? Have I failed him? And he goes home. But for some reason, he's also feeling a little hopeful, and he doesn't quite know why. And on the carriage ride home, he stops by the Sowerby cottage to talk to the mom, but she's not there. He just sees the kids, and they're really sweet, and he gives them a little golden crown, and they're all really excited. And he gets home to the manor, and Mrs. Medlock says that Colin has been looking better, but that he won't eat, and it's been really confusing all the servants, and that he's currently in the garden, because every day he's been spending in the garden with Mary and with Dickon, the boy from Mrs. Sowerby's. And so he decides he'll walk to the garden to find him. And while he's walking, he thinks he hears laughter in the secret garden. He's like, that's so odd. Am I going crazy? And all of a sudden, Colin bursts through the front door of the secret garden and runs into Mr. Craven. And we realize through the narrator that they had been having a race and that Colin had just won. So he was racing with Dickon and Mary, and he had won the race and bursted through the door and run right into his father's arms. And his father barely recognizes him. He says, "Who? What are you?" And Colin's like, "It's me, Dad. I'm healthy. It was the garden." And he's so like just shocked and happy that they take him into the garden and they tell him the whole story. And it's so cute. He laughs along with them at the stories of how they fake it with the servants and how Mrs. Sowerby helped them and the robin, and they're all just so happy, and they walk back to the manor together. So Colin's like, I'm never getting in a chair again. Let's walk back together. And they're all walking back, and Ben is sitting with Mrs. Medlock inside drinking a beer. And she's like, where are they? Have you seen them? And Ben was like, yep, I saw them. I think you'd see them if you look out the window right now. And Mrs. Medlock looks out the window and shrieks because it's Master Colin walking upright. And that's the end of the book, you guys. And that's The Secret Garden. That's it. I mean, what a cute read, right? Like, you didn't read it, but you heard it. And it's really adorable. I think I saw a play of this a long time ago, and I can tell you that I was utterly uninterested in the play. I just zoned out the entire time. That's why this book was almost basically new to me, other than the fact I knew a garden was involved, because I had seen a play of it sometime before, and it was really boring. You know why? Because I think in a play, it's all about the visuals, and I just can't imagine, unless you're on Broadway, maybe, the ability to create the visual effect of what the garden is supposed to be and what the feeling is supposed to be just on stage. Like, I don't know how you could do that. Written down, it's easier because you can tell me the feel of it, and you can tell me, not even using details, what it looks like. But on a play, on a stage, it's just what I see. And if what I see is a bunch of fake flowers, I'm not going to feel the same effect that I felt in the book, you know? So I think there's something to be said for a play being okay and for the book being better. Because, like I said, I saw this play, I think, a really long time ago, and I really did not care about it at all. But some discussion now, shall we? I think that you've probably maybe caught on to the fact that one of the biggest themes here is magic, like I was talking about before. And what I think this is remember how I mentioned that Romanticism was in reaction to the Enlightenment and reaction to the fact that, like, science was really overwhelmingly popular at the time? Well, I think that this book was almost arguing for the fact that science isn't a thing. Not completely, but I think it was a lot about how we make our own destinies and how, like, Colin, nothing was ever really wrong with him. And despite the medicines they gave him, they didn't help. What actually helped was friendship, like nature, fresh air, and being a kid. So, in a way, I think this book in the 1900s was supposed to argue for just put yourself out there, you know? I don't know how strong of an argument it is because it's a children's book, right? And she wrote it on purpose to be a children's book. So the message of live your life and it will be good is not a bad one, I think, even if you're saying that medicine may not be always helpful. And in any case, that's the magic is just a really big part of the book, especially the end. It's not really mentioned at the beginning, barely a couple times. And each time it's mentioned is with a capital M. And it's supposed to be the idea of a higher purpose, a higher being, an earth being, something that is able to suffuse us and everything with joy and power and in general, like, goodness. And I think that's like a really nice thought. Like, that was nice to read. I think it gets a little silly just because Colin goes on about it so much, several chapters worth. But I'll say that's the only thing that knocked me out of it just a teeny bit, was that there was several really long paragraphs about magic. And while it's nice to read because you're reading it knowing that Colin's acting like a real boy, you're like, wow, he's really acting like a real boy. I read several paragraphs and was like, okay, I get that he's acting like a real boy. But it wasn't too bad, and it's an adorable story, and I love all the hugs and the friendships and the adorable things that go on. Another thing that is also a theme here is rejuvenation in spring. So a really big thing in literature that's been around forever is the accompaniment of emotion and life with the seasons. Each of us go through a certain life cycle that's really similar to seasons. So, you know, we're born in the spring and we have summer and then we have fall and then we have winter, right? So that's like the period of our lives. And that's been around for a while. Jane Austen's, I think, is it Mansfield Park? Or Sense and Sensibility? One of Jane Austen's novels, it's Persuasion. Jane Austen's novel Persuasion is really similar to that in that it uses the seasons to convey like a life story. And I think this uses it too, because we start off in the winter. I mean, it's not her whole life. It's not supposed to be an allegory for that, but it is supposed to show us the difference in a human and show how spring and rejuvenation is possible and welcomed in our lives. So we start off in the winter time when Mary is, you know, upset and taken in and grouchy and terrible. And as spring comes, which we learn from the very beginning that spring is on the way. Martha mentions it in like chapter 2 that spring is coming. It will take a while to get here, she says, but spring is coming. And so this whole book is about waiting for spring to come. And the day spring comes is the day that Colin decides to go to the secret garden and decides that he's going to be better. And that's really what this book is. It's about spring and rejuvenation and going outside. And I don't know, it's like a nice little rebirth moment, you know, like a lot of people in this story get rejuvenated. It's, you know, Colin, Mary, who else? Mr. Crawford? What's his name? I'm forgetting his name. Oh my gosh. The man. Craven, Mr. Craven. Mr. Craven gets rejuvenated. Ben Weatherstaff gets rejuvenated. I mean, we're following the life cycle of the robin while he's giving birth to the eggs. Not giving birth, you know, but like while he's preparing for eggs in the spring, like rebirth and rejuvenation are a really big part of the novel. Obviously, as you might have seen so far. Anyway, and that's just nice. It's just nice to read. It's supposed to, you know, just supposed to show us that happens in life and that you should look for it and you should accept it because it's good. And some people don't. And on that line too, while I was reading, I had this theory that Mrs. Medlock at the very beginning really doesn't like Mary, and Mary doesn't like Mrs. Medlock. And it's my theory that Mrs. Medlock is supposed to act. She doesn't have a lot of roles in the book and she doesn't say a lot or do a lot. But I think her role is to be a possible future for Mary, because another thing in this book that I think is important is the idea of future and how the future can kind of bog you down. It doesn't always, but I think it can. So I think that a future without his wife really makes Mr. Craven sad. I think I think, the future that Colin thinks is his of dying sometime soon obviously messes with his head his whole life. And I think that Mary's future, she doesn't see it as she's looking at it, but it is Miss Medlock. If she had not changed, if she had not gone to the manor, I think she would have grown up to be Mrs. Medlock, a not very pleasant woman who yells at children and doesn't really experience any joy or anything like that, and in general just isn't the nicest lady. And I think it's poignant that she sits across from Mrs. Medlock on a train and doesn't see how that could be her one day. And she resents Mrs. Medlock and does not like her. And I think it's important because it really shows us how unobservant she is, how little she cares about her life. And I think it's important at the very beginning to show us that not only is she that way, but she might become Mrs. Medlock and that she doesn't even care, that she doesn't even notice. And later on, she changes and she becomes different and she doesn't get along with Mrs. Medlock, but she grows closer to other people. And it's really important. So I think that's good. What are some other themes that I have? Obviously, nature and land, a lot of that, the spring, the growth, the bloom, the rainy days, finding joy on rainy days and foggy days, and the wind, despite, its spookiness, is really important and that kind of thing. That's really big in the novel, you might have noticed. Human companionship and laughter. And I don't know. I think another one that could be overlooked here is kindness and honesty. I think honesty is a really big one because it's not until people start being honest with Mary that she understands that something's wrong with her. She doesn't know that she's spoiled and she doesn't know she's tyrannical and terrible until Martha says, I'm not helping you with that. You're really queer and odd. She says the word queer, by the way, quote unquote. You're really odd and our maid does better than you and knows how to do more. And that honesty and Ben's honesty of how we both have nasty tempers really gets to her and starts to change her. And she starts to realize that that's not who she wants to be. And the honesty for Colin too. No one ever stood up to him and she yells at him in the middle of his tantrum and all of a sudden it kind of knocks him out of the life that he hated and didn't realize he hated. The honesty is really important because without it, no one changes. And Dickon is honest with just everything he says and everything he does. I mean, he doesn't lie to his mom. He just says, I have a secret, I can't tell you. And eventually he tells her the truth. And I mean, I know that Mary and Colin kind of fake it to their servants because they want it to be a secret, but that's a childish thing of having a secret. I also think that's important here. The secret garden, I think it's important that it's secret because it gives them agency. It's something that they have that's for themselves, that they built for themselves when none of them have ever done that before except for Dickon. Mary and Colin have never done anything just by themselves in their entire lives. And this garden is that one thing. It's their one thing that's theirs and no one else's. And so having a secret like that and then having more is a childish thing they've never been able to do before. So while I know they have secrets, I don't think that's the same as outright lying. And I still think honesty plays a big part here because it's when they're honest with each other that things change. So even when Ben is shocked to see Colin in the garden and his first honest reaction is to say, you aren't a cripple, that motivates Colin to stand up for the first time ever. So I think honesty is a real motivation in this story. And just some other things I really enjoyed while I was reading it. It has a really strong voice, which is surprising because it's in third person. But you hear her voice in your head and you understand how she thinks and you understand where she comes from and how she changes. And I like just the voice of the narrator in general because it's they didn't realize this, but XYZ. And it's funny to read and enjoyable. So it's nice. It's an interesting point of view. And I love getting the point of view of animals and the robin and things that you don't normally expect to get the point of view of. I feel like I'm talking your ear off. I mean, there's so many themes here and there's so many thoughts, but in general, I think the message of the book is that with kindness and with a connection to human friends and with a connection to the wonder of the world around us, that we can all grow into better, happier people. I think the idea is that if you nurture good thoughts and happy actions and happy thoughts, that you will be a good and nice and happy person. And that is a children's literature, what's the word for it? Message. What's the word I'm looking for? The one that starts with an M that has a meaning. It's the moral of the story. is that you can be a good and nice and happy person if you do and think good and nice and happy things. And so it was just really nice to read. Sometimes it's nice to read a book that just has a simple message. I mean, this is no Catcher in the Rye. I'm not here to tell you a depressing story and try and, dissemble a story that kind of makes no sense because he doesn't fully understand it. I mean, this is a story about little kids finding their own agency and making their own choices and choosing to be happier. And it's really uplifting and heartwarming and very cute. And it's proven that this is a big deal and that people really understand it and are lifted up by it because it's been made into like 3 movies and 2 plays and all of these different adaptations because people want to hear this story over and over again. And I think that that's totally fair because it's really cute. So, I mean, it was announced one of the greatest books of all time, I think, by some sort of award. I read that somewhere. I'm sorry I don't have the resource for you, but yeah, it's one of the world's most well-loved children's stories, and it makes sense to me. So I know this was a fairly simple book for me to talk to you about this week. I just chose one that's simple on purpose because I was just thought it'd be fun, and I thought that it'd be nice to read, and I was right. You know what? It was. So, and I'm really excited that I got to wrap up September with this because I'm super excited for October. And this one actually was a really good preparation, I think, because in the month of October, since it's Halloween, I'm doing lots of spooky novels, which I'm super excited about. I have a bunch planned out. And this one was a little bit gothic at the beginning, a little mysterious. So I feel like it fit in well with the books that I have upcoming. So I can tell you some of our layout. I actually do have a list of all the upcoming books and the books that we cover in the season on our Instagram at Bad Bookclub Pod. But just so you know, the month of October will discuss The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. It will discuss Twilight, because I think that'll be really funny. It'll also discuss Carmilla, which is an old novella that inspired Dracula, which I've read before that I really like. And I'll be talking about Stephen King's It, which I've never read before, which is an absolute monster. It's really long. So I have all those books ready to go for Halloween, and I'm super excited to talk to you about them because I just love the fall and I love Halloween, and I can't wait. So I hope that you tune in next week for The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. And like I said before, if you want more information, you can always follow us on all of our socials at Bad Book Club Pod. And if you want to support the podcast, you can go to the shop that I have and you can buy one of the merchandise that I make myself. I've designed several that say Bad Book Club, or I have one shirt design that says Always Reading, which is kind of fun. And if you also want to support the podcast, I do have an affiliate link that I'll put below where you can buy one of the books I talk about and support a local bookstore and the podcast all at the same time. So anyway, I really appreciate you guys listening with me. I hope you liked this sweet and short and simple little episode that I have for you. If you did, please remember to subscribe and review the podcast. It really helps me get out there and get to more people, and I would love you forever. And I can't wait to see you guys next week. I'll be 23 when I talk to you then, so there'll be a big difference, I'm sure, in my demeanor and in general wiseness, because everyone knows that happens when you turn a year older. So anyway, I'm really happy. Thank you for tuning in and listening to me today. It was super fun to talk about. And I'll see you next week for The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which I'm really excited to discuss with you because it blew my mind. So I'm really excited. I keep saying that, but you know what? There's magic everywhere, all right? There's just magic. And so I'll see you next time. Goodbye, lovelies.